The kingdom of Eldermere, a vast and unremarkable stretch of land nestled between two gently sloping hills that were neither too steep nor too shallow, had existed for centuries in a state of such profound tedium that even the most dedicated historians struggled to recall anything of note that had occurred within its borders. The land was primarily composed of fields, endless, undulating fields of wheat, barley, and the occasional patch of turnips, all swaying in a wind that was neither too brisk nor too sluggish, just consistent enough to be forgotten almost immediately after noticing it. The peasants who worked these fields were a homogeneous lot, their faces weathered by years of repetitive toil, their conversations revolving almost exclusively around the predictably mediocre harvests and the unchanging price of grain. The local lord, a man by the name of Baron Hargrove, was a figure of such staggering unoriginality that even his own scribes often forgot to record his decrees, which mostly concerned the proper storage of root vegetables and the occasional taxation of sheep. His castle, a damp and crumbling structure that had not seen repairs in generations, stood atop a hill that was neither imposing nor picturesque, its grey stones blending seamlessly into the overcast sky that seemed to perpetually hang over Eldermere. Within its walls, the Baron's servants moved about the duties with a lethargy born of endless routine, scrubbing the same patches of floor, mending the same frayed tapestries, and preparing the same bland stews day after day, year after year, century after century. The only notable event in recent memory had been a minor dispute between two farmers over a missing goat, a conflict that had been resolved with all the excitement of a damp towel being wrung out, and even that had been forgotten within a fortnight. Chapter 2. As the seasons turned with the same unvarying rhythm they had followed for generations, the people of Eldermere continued their lives in a state of blissful monotony, undisturbed by the outside world, which seemed to have forgotten their existence entirely. The Baron's son, a young man named Edwin, was perhaps the only individual in the entire kingdom who harbored even the faintest glimmer of ambition, though even this was a meager thing, amounting to little more than a vague desire to one day repaint the family crest in slightly brighter colors. He spent his days wandering the castle's draughty halls, occasionally pausing to stare out of the narrow, grime-streaked windows at the unchanging landscape beyond, where the same farmers tended the same fields in the same methodical fashion they always had. His tutors, all of whom were elderly men with voices as dry as the parchment they read from, droned on endlessly about the history of Eldermere's tax policies and the genealogies of various local sheep-herding families, their lessons delivered in such a uniformly dull tone that Edwin often found himself slipping into a light doze before the first hour had passed. The castle's librarian, a frail man whose sole passion in life was the meticulous cataloguing of mildew growth on the older manuscripts, occasionally attempted to engage the young lord in conversation about the thrilling world of medieval crop rotation techniques, but these exchanges were brief and unmemorable, fading from Edwin's mind almost as soon as they had occurred. Meanwhile, in the village below, the blacksmith hammered the same horseshoes, the weaver spun the same coarse wool, and the innkeeper served the same lukewarm ale to the same handful of patrons, none of whom had anything new to say. Chapter 3. One particularly uneventful afternoon, as the sun hung lazily in the sky, neither too hot nor too cold, a traveling merchant passed through Eldermere, his cart laden with goods that were, for the most part, of little interest to the locals. He offered spices too exotic to be of use in their bland cuisine, fabrics too fine to withstand the relentless damp of the region, and trinkets too frivolous to appeal to a populace concerned chiefly with the durability of their farming tools. The merchant, a man of middling height and unremarkable appearance, paused at the village's sole inn, where he attempted to engage the patrons in conversation about the wider world, its wars, its trade disputes, its occasional outbreaks of plague, but the villagers merely nodded politely before returning to their drinks, their eyes glazing over with disinterest. Even the news of a distant king's coronation failed to stir them, for what did kings matter when there were turnips to be planted? The merchant, sensing that his audience was unreceptive, soon departed, his cart creaking as it rolled down the same muddy road that had brought him in, leaving no lasting impression on Eldermere whatsoever. That evening, As the villagers gathered in their cottages to eat their simple meals of bread and stew, the only topic of conversation was the unseasonably mild weather and whether it might lead to a slightly earlier harvest, a discussion that petered out quickly as the listeners succumbed one by one to the comforting embrace of sleep. Chapter 4. Years passed in Eldermere with the same steady, unremarkable pace as always, the turning of the seasons marked only by the gradual greying of Baron Hargrove's beard and the slow, inevitable decay of the castle's eastern tower, which had begun to lean at an angle so slight that only the most observant of the servants had noticed. Edwin, now a man of 30, had abandoned his youthful dreams of repainting the family crest, having concluded that the effort required to procure the necessary pigments was not worth the negligible improvement it would bring to his life. Instead, he devoted his time to the study of local fungi, a pursuit that was neither intellectually stimulating nor practically useful, but which at least provided him with an excuse to wander the woods occasionally, where the trees grew in the same predictable patterns they always had. Meanwhile, the village continued its existence unchanged, the children of previous generations growing up to take the places of their parents in the fields, the forge, and the alehouse, their lives unfolding with the same lack of incident as those who had come before them. The only minor disruption to this routine came when a particularly persistent crow took up residence in the castle's courtyard, where it pecked at the same patch of gravel every morning for weeks on end, a behavior so inexplicably mundane that even the castle's steward, a man who prided himself on noting every minor household occurrence, eventually ceased to record it in his ledgers. Chapter 5. In time, Baron Hargrove passed away peacefully in his sleep, his death so expected and uneventful that the castle's physician barely paused in his breakfast to confirm it. Edwin, now the new Baron, oversaw the funeral arrangements with the same lack of enthusiasm he brought to all his duties, the ceremony itself a brief and poorly attended affair, as most of the villagers were occupied with the day's farming tasks and saw no reason to interrupt their work for the sake of a man who had done little to distinguish himself in life. The castle's chaplain, a man whose sermons were renowned for their ability to induce drowsiness even in the most restless of listeners, delivered a eulogy that was neither moving nor memorable, its most notable feature being its merciful brevity. Afterward, the servants returned to their routines, the villagers to their fields, and Edwin to his study of fungi, the kingdom of Eldermere continuing on as it always had, unchanging, unremarkable, and utterly devoid of anything that might disturb the soothing monotony of its existence. Even the weather seemed to respect the kingdom's preference for dullness, the skies remaining a uniform shade of grey, the rain falling in the same gentle, unvarying pattern it had for generations, and the wind blowing just enough to stir the wheat fields but never enough to cause any real excitement. And so, as the sun set once more over the quiet hills of Eldermere, its people slept soundly, untroubled by dreams or ambitions, their lives as predictable and restful as the turning of the pages in a very, very long and exceedingly boring book, certainly. Here are the next 5 chapters of this deliberately monotonous and sleep-inducing historical tale, continuing in the same unbroken, overly detailed style. Each chapter flows seamlessly into the next, maintaining the same dull, uneventful tone to help lull you into sleep. Chapter 6. The reign of Baron Edwin began much as his father's had ended, with a resounding lack of fanfare or notable occurrence. The castle's scribe, a man whose handwriting was as unremarkable as his personality, dutifully recorded the new baron's ascension in the kingdom's annals, a document so rarely consulted that the ink had long since faded on most of its pages. Edwin's first official decree was to adjust the tax rate on hay by a fraction of a percentage, a change so minor that even the farmers most affected by it failed to notice, their minds occupied instead by the relentless mundanity of the daily chores. The castle's staff, having long since grown accustomed to the predictability of the duties, continued their routines without interruption, sweeping the same dusty corridors, polishing the same tarnished candlesticks, and preparing the same bland meals that had sustained the Hargrove lineage for generations. In the village, life proceeded as always, the blacksmith's hammer striking the anvil in the same rhythmic pattern it had for decades, the weaver's loom creaking with the same familiar monotony, and the innkeeper's ale flowing as steadily and unremarkably as the nearby creek, which neither flooded nor dried up but maintained a perfect, forgettable balance year after year. The only vaguely noteworthy event during this time was the discovery of a previously unnoticed crack in the castle's wine cellar wall, a development that was met with neither alarm nor interest, as the wine stored within was of such poor quality that its potential spoilage was of little concern to anyone. Chapter 7. As the years stretched on, the kingdom of Eldermere remained untouched by the outside world, its existence so inconsequential that neighboring realms seldom bothered to include it on their maps, and when they did, it was often as a small, indistinct blotch that could easily be mistaken for a smudge of ink. Edwin, now well into middle age, had taken to spending his afternoons in the castle's neglected herb garden, where he would sit for hours on end, watching the same bees visit the same flowers in the same unhurried pattern day after day. His steward, a man whose chief talent was his ability to make even the most straightforward administrative tasks seem interminable, would occasionally approach him with matters requiring his attention, a dispute over the ownership of a particularly unremarkable plough, a request to repair a section of fence that had sagged slightly more than usual, but these issues were resolved with such bureaucratic lethargy that they barely registered as events at all. Meanwhile, in the village, the children who had once played in the same dirt paths their parents had played in were now adults themselves, their lives indistinguishable from those of the previous generation, their conversations revolving around the same topics of weather, crops, and the occasional benign gossip about whose turn it was to mend the communal well. The seasons turned without drama, the harvests were neither bountiful nor meager, and the occasional traveler who passed through did so without leaving any lasting impression, their presence forgotten before the dust had even settled on the road. Chapter 8. A particularly uneventful winter settled over Eldermere, its arrival heralded by a gradual cooling of the air so slight that it went unnoticed until the first frost dusted the fields in a thin, lackluster layer of white. The villagers, having long since grown accustomed to the predictability of the climate, retrieved their same patched cloaks from storage and continued their routines with only the barest adjustments for the cold. The castle, never particularly warm to begin with, became only marginally more uncomfortable, its inhabitants huddling near the same fireplaces that had provided inadequate heat for centuries, their breath visible in the air as they went about the duties with the same resigned diligence as always. Edwin, now sporting a beard that had greyed at the same leisurely pace as his father's before him, took to wearing an extra layer of woolen undergarments, a decision that brought him neither discomfort nor satisfaction but simply existed as one more minor adaptation in a life defined by them. The winter passed without storms, without shortages, and without any of the hardships that might have lent it even a semblance of narrative interest, the snow melting away in the spring with the same quiet efficiency it had arrived, leaving behind mud that was neither particularly deep nor particularly troublesome, just another transient feature of the landscape to be ignored until it dried. Chapter 9. In the 43rd year of Baron Edwin's reign, a number noted only because the castle's scribe had a peculiar fondness for tallying things of no consequence, a minor debate arose among the villagers regarding the optimal length of time to soak dried beans before cooking them. This discussion, which might have passed entirely unnoticed in a livelier kingdom, became the closest thing to a controversy that Eldermere had experienced in decades, with factions forming around the 2-hour versus the 3-hour soaking method, each side presenting arguments so tedious that even the participants struggled to remain invested in the outcome. The debate dragged on for weeks, if it could even be called a debate, as the exchanges were conducted in the same slow, meandering fashion as all conversations in Eldermere, with long pauses between sentences and frequent digressions into unrelated topics such as the durability of various cooking pots and the merits of different kinds of firewood. Eventually, the matter was resolved not through any decisive conclusion but simply because the villagers grew bored of discussing it and returned to the usual routines, the beans themselves being of such mediocre quality that no one could honestly claim to notice a difference in taste regardless of how long they were soaked. Edwin, upon hearing of this non-event, nodded absently before returning his attention to the latest in his endless series of fungal sketches, none of which were ever looked at by anyone else, including himself. Chapter 10. As the decades wore on, the kingdom of Eldermere continued its existence in a state of such profound uneventfulness that even the passage of time seemed to slow, each year blending seamlessly into the next with no more distinction than one grain of sand has from another. Edwin, now an old man, had long since abandoned even the pretense of governance, his role as Baron having devolved into little more than a ceremonial title, his presence required only for the occasional signing of documents so trivial that their contents were forgotten before the ink had dried. The castle, never a bustling hub of activity to begin with, had grown even quieter, its halls echoing with the soft, shuffling footsteps of servants who had served for so long that they moved as though in a dream, their actions automatic, their thoughts elsewhere. The village, too, had changed only in the most imperceptible of ways, the faces of its inhabitants growing older but their lives remaining the same, their days filled with the same tasks, their nights with the same restful, dreamless sleep. And when, at last, Edwin passed away as quietly and unremarkably as his father before him, the kingdom barely paused to acknowledge it, the news spreading slowly and without urgency, the villagers receiving it with the same mild indifference they might afford a slightly overcast day. His successor, a distant cousin whose name no one could quite remember, arrived without ceremony, took up residence in the same draughty castle, and began his reign exactly as Edwin had, by doing nothing of note whatsoever. And so, beneath the same grey sky, surrounded by the same endless fields, the people of Eldermere carried on, their lives as steady and unchanging as the tides of a sea that was neither calm nor stormy, but simply, perpetually, there. Chapter 11. The distant cousin who inherited Eldermere's throne was named Oswin, a man whose most distinguishing characteristic was his complete lack of distinguishing characteristics. He had the same watery blue eyes as every Hargrove before him, the same slightly hunched posture from years of bending over uninteresting documents, and the same habit of sighing quietly to himself whenever presented with any matter requiring more than minimal attention. His first act as Baron was to approve the previous year's grain reports without reading them, a tradition upheld by his predecessors for generations. The castle's steward, a man who had served since Edwin's early reign and whose face had long since settled into a permanent expression of mild indigestion, presented Oswin with a list of household matters requiring attention. A leaking roof in the north wing, the same leak that had been noted in the steward's records for 19 years, a dispute between two kitchen maids over the proper way to peel turnips, a debate that had actually begun during Baron Hargrove's time but had lain dormant for a decade, and the question of whether to repair or replace the castle's oldest tapestry, which depicted an ancestor hunting in a forest that no longer existed, if it ever had. Oswin considered these matters with all the energy they deserved, which is to say, very little, before deciding to postpone any decisions indefinitely, a ruling that satisfied everyone involved since it required no actual action from anyone. In the village below, life continued as always, with farmers rising at dawn to tend the same fields the great-grandfathers had tended, blacksmiths hammering the same simple tools that had been in use for centuries, and children playing the same games of stick and hoop that had amused generations of Eldermere youth. The seasons turned with the usual reliability, bringing neither drought nor flood but the same steady, unremarkable weather patterns that had defined the region's climate for as long as anyone could remember. Chapter 12. As Oswin settled into his role as Baron, he discovered that governing Eldermere required almost no actual governance. The kingdom's laws, such as they were, had remained unchanged for so long that even the oldest villages couldn't remember a time when they'd needed to be enforced. The few disputes that arose, typically concerning the boundaries between fields or the occasional wandering sheep, were resolved by village elders using traditions so ancient and ingrained that no one thought to question them. The castle's sole guard, a man named Hobson who had held the position for 37 years without ever drawing his sword, spent his days dozing in the gatehouse, waking only to turn away the rare traveler who might stumble upon Eldermere's single, poorly maintained road. Oswin's days fell into a pattern as unchanging as the landscape. He would rise late, take a meager breakfast of porridge and weak ale, spend an hour or two pretending to review accounts, though in truth he mostly stared out the window at the same view of fields and forests he'd seen every day of his life, take a lengthy nap after lunch, then pass the evening listening to his steward drone on about matters of no consequence before retiring to bed at an early hour. The only variation in this routine came on the 7th day of each week, when Oswin was expected to hold court, a formality that typically involved listening to 3 or 4 villagers complain about the same minor grievances that had been brought before his predecessors for generations, then issuing the same non-committal responses that satisfied no one but at least allowed everyone to feel they'd fulfilled their obligations. Chapter 13. The years passed in Eldermere with the same quiet relentlessness as the dripping of a leaky tap in an unused room. Oswin's hair greyed, his posture became slightly more stooped, and the castle's few remaining tapestries faded another degree or two, but otherwise little changed. The village celebrated its annual harvest festival with the same modest enthusiasm as always, the same slightly off-key singing of traditional songs whose origins had been forgotten, the same mildly undercooked pies entered into the same baking competition that no one particularly wanted to win, the same half-hearted attempts by the village youths to impress each other with feats of strength that were neither particularly impressive nor particularly weak. In the castle, Oswin's steward finally retired, or possibly died. The records were unclear on this point and was replaced by his nephew, a man whose chief qualification was his ability to maintain the same level of benign incompetence that had served the position so well for generations. The castle's cook, who had been preparing the same 7 meals in weekly rotation for 40 years, briefly experimented with adding thyme to the Sunday stew, but this innovation was met with such universal indifference that she abandoned it after 3 attempts. In the village, the blacksmith's apprentice finally completed his training after 22 years of study, an event marked by a small ceremony where he was presented with his own hammer, nearly identical to the one he'd been using since childhood, and a speech from the village elder that lasted just long enough for most attendees to forget why they'd gathered in the first place. The seasons continued their stately procession, each one indistinguishable from its counterpart a decade earlier, the rhythm of planting and harvest as reliable as the sunrise. Chapter 14. In what might have been the 15th or possibly the 20th year of Oswin's reign, the castle's records being somewhat inconsistent on this point, as the scribe responsible for keeping track had developed a habit of napping through entire seasons, a minor event occurred that nearly qualified as noteworthy. A traveling scholar passed through Eldermere. This individual, a thin man with a perpetually runny nose and a habit of sneezing unexpectedly, claimed to be compiling a history of the region's noble families. He spent 3 days in the castle archives, sneezing on documents that hadn't been disturbed in living memory, before concluding that the Hargrove lineage was unusually consistent, which was his polite way of saying they had done nothing worth recording for at least 6 generations. When he attempted to interview Oswin about his family's history, the Baron could recall no stories or anecdotes beyond vague memories of his father complaining about the damp and his grandfather's preference for a particular brand of woolen socks. The scholar left as quietly as he had arrived, taking with him nothing more exciting than a mild cold that circulated through the castle staff for a few weeks before fading away like everything else in Eldermere. Oswin, mildly curious about what the scholar might write about his family, considered sending a messenger to inquire, but the effort required to organize such an expedition seemed disproportionate to the likely dullness of the response, so he abandoned the idea before even rising from his chair. In the village, news of the scholar's visit spread slowly and without much interest, serving as a topic of conversation for perhaps half a day before being forgotten in favor of more pressing matters, such as whether this year's apple crop would be as mediocre as last year's. Chapter 15. As Oswin entered what might charitably be called his twilight years, though in truth there was little difference between his twilight and any other time of day in Eldermere, he found himself thinking occasionally about succession. The question of who would inherit his title was complicated by the fact that he had never married, had no children, and couldn't recall whether he had any living relatives beyond a possibly imaginary second cousin who might or might not reside in a neighboring kingdom. After several months of intermittent consideration interrupted by frequent naps and the more pressing matter of whether to have his chamber's curtains cleaned, Oswin finally mentioned the issue to his steward, who responded with the same lack of urgency that characterized all matters in Eldermere. The steward promised to investigate possible heirs, a process that involved digging through genealogical records so dusty and neglected that simply opening them triggered a sneezing fit that lasted most of the afternoon. After weeks of half-hearted research, the steward presented Oswin with 3 potential candidates: a great-nephew who was currently studying to become a monk and thus unlikely to want the position, a second cousin twice removed who reportedly had a slight limp and a fondness for mushroom collecting, and a distant relation whose chief virtue was that he lived closer than the others. Oswin, after considering these options with all the energy he could muster, which is to say, very little, decided to postpone the decision indefinitely, reasoning that he wasn't dead yet and there was no sense rushing into anything. The matter was filed away in the castle's archives, where it joined countless other unresolved issues in a state of permanent deferral. And so life in Eldermere continued its placid course, undisturbed by ambition or change, as predictable and comforting as a well-worn pair of slippers that had long since lost their shape but were too familiar to discard. The fields were planted and harvested, the seasons turned, and the people of Eldermere went about their lives with quiet contentment, untroubled by the thought that anything might ever be different. Chapter 16. The question of succession in Eldermere remained unresolved through 3 more harvest festivals, 2 mild winters, and an unusually persistent bout of drizzle that lasted from mid-spring well into summer. Oswin's steward, having dutifully avoided the matter for as long as possible, eventually passed away peacefully at his desk while reviewing a particularly soporific report on turnip yields, his head coming to rest on a ledger showing that this year's crop was, as usual, neither better nor worse than average. His replacement, a younger man with all the ambition of a hibernating hedgehog, took one look at the genealogical records and promptly developed a headache that conveniently prevented him from making any progress on the issue. Meanwhile, Oswin himself found that advancing age had brought with it a pleasant reduction in expectations. No one bothered him with trivial matters anymore, and even the weekly court sessions had dwindled to the point where he could often spend the entire afternoon sitting in comfortable silence, broken only by the occasional snore from the castle guard who always dozed off during proceedings. The villagers, sensing that their baron was entering his final years, began preparing for his passing in the same unhurried way they approached all tasks: a few extra prayers at the harvest festival, some quiet discussions about where to source mourning clothes when the time came, and the blacksmith's casual inspection of his tools to ensure they'd be ready to fashion a suitably unremarkable coffin when needed. Life continued with its usual rhythm, undisturbed by thoughts of mortality or change, as steady and predictable as the creak of the old mill wheel turning in the village stream. Chapter 17. The long-anticipated yet somehow still unexpected death of Baron Oswin occurred on a Tuesday, or possibly a Wednesday, the exact day being difficult to determine as the castle's calendar hadn't been updated since the year of the Great Turnip Blight which, in typical Eldermere fashion, hadn't been particularly great or particularly blighted. He was found by a chambermaid who had come to change his bedsheets, a task she performed every 3rd week whether they needed it or not. The maid, showing remarkable presence of mind for someone who had spent her entire life in Eldermere, first checked to make sure he wasn't simply napping, a reasonable assumption, given that Oswin had been known to sleep through breakfast, lunch, and occasionally dinner, then quietly informed the steward, who in turn told the cook, who mentioned it to the stable boy, and so the news spread through the castle with all the urgency of molasses flowing uphill in winter. By the time anyone thought to officially record the Baron's passing, 3 days had elapsed, during which the castle staff had continued about their routines with only minor adjustments, setting out one less place at meals, speaking in slightly more hushed tones in the corridors, and taking care not to disturb what they assumed was Oswin's corpse until someone more qualified could confirm it was actually dead and not just unusually still. The village received the news with polite interest, the farmers pausing in their fieldwork just long enough to nod sagely before returning to their plows, their thoughts already turning to more pressing matters like whether the afternoon might bring rain, it wouldn't, or if supper would be the usual pottage, it would. Chapter 18. With Oswin finally and definitively deceased, the castle physician having confirmed this by holding a mirror to his mouth and observing no fog, then double-checking by leaving the mirror in place for 3 days just to be certain, the question of succession could no longer be politely ignored. The steward, after considerable procrastination and 2 false starts caused by misplacing the genealogical charts, finally identified Oswin's heir. A third cousin named Almeric who lived in a neighboring valley and made his living as a wool merchant of modest means. A messenger was dispatched with all due haste, which in Eldermere terms meant he left within the fortnight, travelling at a pace that would have frustrated a snail but suited the castle staff perfectly. When the message finally reached Almeric, he received the news with the same mild surprise one might show upon finding an extra sock in the laundry, not unpleasant, but hardly life-changing. After consulting with his wife, who was mostly concerned about whether the castle had decent kitchen facilities, packing his belongings, a process that took nearly a month as he kept forgetting where he'd put his best tunic, and saying farewell to his neighbors, a series of conversations that consisted mainly of discussing the weather and promising to write, though everyone knew he wouldn't, Almeric set out for Eldermere at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently to admire views that weren't particularly admirable and to rest at inns where the ale was as forgettable as the conversation. His journey, which could have been completed in 3 days by anyone with a modicum of urgency, stretched into 3 weeks, during which time the castle staff kept busy by doing exactly what they'd always done, just slightly more slowly than usual. Chapter 19. Almeric's arrival at Eldermere Castle was so understated that several members of the household failed to notice it at all. There was no fanfare, no ceremonial greeting, just a quiet conversation with the steward in the courtyard that might have been about succession or might have been about the unseasonably cool weather. It was difficult to tell from the outside. After being shown to his chambers, which Oswin had rarely used, preferring to sleep in a smaller room with fewer drafts, Almeric spent his first evening as Baron-elect examining his new home with the same level of enthusiasm one might show when presented with a slightly used handkerchief. The castle was exactly as unimpressive as he'd imagined, drafty in the winter, stuffy in summer, and perpetually damp all year round. The furnishings were worn but serviceable, the tapestries faded but intact, and the general atmosphere one of comfortable neglect. After a simple supper, boiled chicken, boiled potatoes, and boiled greens, the cook believing firmly that any flavor stronger than warm was dangerously exotic, Almeric retired early, sleeping soundly in a bed that was neither too soft nor too hard, but exactly as mediocre as everything else in Eldermere. The next morning, he was formally presented to the villagers during what passed for a ceremony, really just the weekly market day with slightly cleaner shirts than usual. The villagers greeted their new baron with polite nods before returning to their haggling over eggs and yarn, satisfied that their new ruler seemed unlikely to disrupt the comforting monotony of their lives. Almeric, for his part, was pleased to note that governing Eldermere appeared to require even less effort than running his wool business, a realization that filled him with quiet contentment as he strolled back to the castle for his customary mid-morning nap. Chapter 20. Almeric's coronation, if it could be called that, was a simple affair conducted with all the pomp and circumstance one would expect from a kingdom where the most exciting annual event was the weighing of the largest turnip. The castle chaplain, a man whose voice had grown hoarse from decades of underuse, mumbled through the traditional oaths while Almeric stood patiently, shifting his weight from foot to foot and wondering when lunch would be served. The ceremony concluded with the placing of the ceremonial baronial hat on Almeric's head. A slightly moth-eaten velvet cap that had been in the Hargrove family for generations and smelled faintly of camphor and disuse. The villagers, having been promised a free meal afterward, bread and soup, naturally, The castle budget couldn't stretch to anything more extravagant, lingered just long enough to be polite before hurrying to the trestle tables set up in the courtyard. Conversations revolved around the usual topics. The weather mild, the crops adequate, and the new baron seems harmless enough before everyone returned to their homes well before dusk, satisfied that the day's events had been sufficiently uneventful to qualify as a success. As for Almeric, he spent his first official evening as Baron of Eldermere exactly as he would spend most evenings to come, sitting by the fire in the great hall, which wasn't particularly great, but was at least moderately sized, sipping weak ale, and listening to his steward drone on about matters so trivial they barely qualified as matters at all. Outside, the stars shone down on Eldermere with the usual indifference. The wind rustled the same trees it had rustled for centuries, and the kingdom slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a place where nothing ever happened, nothing ever changed, and nothing ever would. Chapter 21. The early days of Almeric's reign passed with the same tranquil uneventfulness that had characterized Eldermere for generations, the new baron settling into his role with an ease that came from having no particular ambitions or desires beyond maintaining the status quo that had served his predecessors so well for so long. His mornings began late, as the castle's servants had long since learned not to disturb their lord before he rang for them, a habit Almeric had no intention of breaking, and he would take his breakfast in bed, a simple meal of porridge sweetened with the same honey that had been harvested from the castle apiary for decades, accompanied by weak tea that had been steeped precisely long enough to change the water's color but not long enough to develop any actual flavor. After this leisurely start to the day, Almeric would dress himself in garments that were nearly identical to those worn by Oswin before him, the castle tailor having simply adjusted the previous baron's clothing to fit the new ruler, as there seemed little point in creating new outfits when the old ones were still perfectly serviceable if slightly faded at the elbows and cuffs. The business of governing, such as it was, occupied very little of Almeric's time, consisting mainly of listening to the steward's daily reports about matters of no consequence, the ongoing debate about whether to repair the castle's south wall this year or next, the question of whether to purchase an additional 2 goats for the castle dairy, a decision that had been under consideration for 3 years running, and the weekly accounting of grain stores that never varied by more than a few bushels from season to season. These meetings typically concluded within the hour, after which Almeric would take a brief stroll through the castle gardens, where the same flowers bloomed in the same patterns they had for generations, tended by the same gardener who had served under the last 3 barons and showed no signs of retiring despite being at least 80 years old. The afternoons were reserved for what Almeric considered the most demanding part of his duties, the weekly court sessions where villagers could bring their grievances before their lord, though in practice these sessions were sparsely attended and usually involved the same handful of petitioners bringing the same complaints that had been brought before the court for decades, old man Thatcher's perennial grumbling about his neighbors, chickens wandering into his vegetable patch, Widow Cresswell's annual request for a reduction in her rent due to the poor yield of her apple trees, a yield that was, in fact, perfectly average, and the ongoing dispute between the miller and the baker about whose fault it was that last winter's flour had been slightly more gritty than usual. Almeric handled these matters with the same dispassionate indifference his predecessors had shown, issuing rulings that were neither particularly fair nor particularly unfair but were always perfectly in keeping with tradition, after which he would retire to his chambers for a nap that often lasted until dinner, a meal that varied only slightly from day to day, following a weekly rotation that the castle cook had maintained for so long that even the mice in the pantry could predict what would be served on any given evening. The evenings were spent in the great hall, where Almeric would sit by the fire, which was always kept at precisely the same moderate blaze, never roaring but never allowed to go out completely, and listen to whatever minstrel happened to be passing through Eldermere that week, though minstrel was perhaps too grand a term for the traveling musicians who occasionally visited the castle, most of whom knew only 3 or 4 songs and played them with more enthusiasm than skill. When no entertainment was available, which was most nights, Almeric would pass the time by reading from the castle's small collection of books, all of which were at least a century old and dealt with such thrilling topics as the history of sheep husbandry in the northern provinces and a detailed treatise on the proper storage of root vegetables. By the time the castle clock struck 10, a sound that was more of a dull thud than an actual chime, as the mechanism hadn't worked properly in living memory, Almeric would retire to bed, where he would sleep the dreamless sleep of a man whose life contained no surprises, no challenges, and no particular joys beyond the comfort of routine. Chapter 22. As the seasons turned in their predictable fashion, Almeric's reign settled into a rhythm so steady it could have set a metronome to shame, each day blending seamlessly into the next with no more variation than one grain of sand has from another. The castle staff, having initially been curious about their new lord, soon realized that Almeric differed from Oswin in no meaningful way and returned to their accustomed routines with the quiet satisfaction of people who prefer predictability over novelty. The steward continued to present his daily reports with the same solemnity as always, though both he and Almeric knew these were little more than formalities, as the actual governance of Eldermere required about as much effort as breathing. It happened naturally, without conscious thought, and any attempt to change its rhythm would have been more trouble than it was worth. The village, too, adapted quickly to the new baron, the farmers pausing in their fieldwork just long enough to note that Almeric seemed a decent enough sort before returning to their ploughs, their assessment based not on any particular action of their new lord but rather on his notable lack of action, which was the highest praise any Eldermere ruler could hope to receive. The blacksmith, when asked his opinion of Almeric, simply shrugged and said, "He hasn't bothered me none," a statement that was immediately recognized as a ringing endorsement and was subsequently repeated throughout the village as proof that the transition of power had been successful. Even the livestock seemed unaffected by the change in leadership, the castle's dairy cows producing the same steady supply of milk, neither abundant nor scarce, the chickens laying the same predictable number of eggs, usually 3 dozen per week, except in winter when it dropped to 2, and the castle dogs maintaining the usual routine of sleeping in sunny patches by day and snoring by the hearth at night. The only person in the entire kingdom who showed any concern about Almeric's rule was the castle scribe, a nervous little man who had spent 40 years recording the comings and goings of Eldermere's nobility and was now faced with the distressing realization that Almeric's reign was proving even more uneventful than Oswin's had been, leaving him with almost nothing to write in the official chronicles beyond repetitive notes about the weather and the occasional visit from a traveling merchant. After several months of struggling to find something, anything, worth recording, the scribe hit upon the solution of simply copying entries from previous years and changing the dates, a practice that went unnoticed by everyone including Almeric, who never bothered to read the chronicles anyway. The years rolled by with the quiet inevitability of waves lapping at a very calm shore, each one bringing minor changes that were so insignificant they barely qualified as changes at all. Almeric's hair began to grey at the temples, the castle's east wall developed a new crack that was almost but not quite identical to the one it had had the previous year, and the village welcomed 3 new babies, all boys, all healthy, all destined to grow up to be farmers just like their fathers before them. The harvests continued to be adequate, the winters mild, and the summers pleasantly warm without being uncomfortably hot. Travelers passing through Eldermere remarked on its unremarkable nature, some going so far as to call it quaint, or peaceful, though most simply forgot about it entirely within a few days of leaving its borders. Even time itself seemed to move more slowly in Eldermere, as if reluctant to disturb the kingdom's perfect equilibrium, the hours stretching languidly from one to the next without urgency or fanfare, the minutes dripping by like honey from a spoon on a cool autumn day. Chapter 23. The 20th year of Almeric's reign began much like the 19th had ended, with a gentle spring rain that lasted exactly as long as the farmers needed it to and not a moment longer, the clouds parting on the morning of the planting festival with the punctuality of a well-trained servant. The festival itself was the same as it had been for generations, the same slightly off-key singing of traditional planting songs, the same ceremonial first sowing performed by the village elder, a man so old he could barely lift the seed basket, let alone scatter its contents with any accuracy, and the same modest feast afterward featuring the same dishes that had been served at every planting festival in living memory: thick vegetable soup, fresh bread with honey, and the castle's special reserve ale that was distinguishable from the regular ale only by being served in slightly nicer mugs. Almeric, as was tradition, attended the festival and made the same speech his predecessors had made for decades, a brief homily about the importance of hard work and the bounty of the land that no one really listened to, but everyone politely applauded when it was over. The only notable aspect of this particular festival was that Almeric, for the first time in his reign, found himself feeling slightly unwell afterward, a vague discomfort in his stomach that he attributed to having eaten too much of the cook's heavy bread rather than any actual illness. This passing malaise would have been forgotten entirely had it not returned the following week, and then again the week after that, growing gradually more persistent until even Almeric, who was not given to undue concern about his health, was forced to acknowledge that something might be amiss. The castle physician, a man whose medical knowledge was at least 50 years out of date and who had never actually treated anything more serious than a sprained ankle, examined Almeric with all the thoroughness one would expect from someone who spent most of his time napping in the herb garden, and pronounced that the Baron was suffering from an imbalance of humors that would surely correct itself in time. When it didn't, the physician prescribed a tonic of boiled herbs that tasted dreadful and did nothing whatsoever, followed by a regimen of bed rest that Almeric only partially observed, as lying in bed all day struck him as being even more boring than his usual routine. The villagers, when they heard of their lord's indisposition, reacted with the same mild concern they would have shown for a neighbor's ailing goat. They wished it a speedy recovery, but didn't dwell on the matter overmuch, confident that whatever was wrong would either get better or it wouldn't, and in either case there was nothing they could do about it. As the months passed, Almeric's condition neither improved nor significantly worsened, settling into a sort of persistent low-grade illness that left him tired but not bedridden, uncomfortable but not in pain, and generally out of sorts but not so much that it interfered with his ability to perform the minimal duties required of him. Life in Eldermere continued as always, the rhythm of planting and harvest undisturbed by their Baron's slow decline, the castle staff adjusting their routines slightly to accommodate his reduced energy but otherwise carrying on as they always had. Even the steward's daily reports continued unchanged, though they were now delivered in a slightly softer voice and occasionally abbreviated when Almeric seemed particularly fatigued. The only real change was that Almeric no longer attended the weekly court sessions, delegating this responsibility to the steward, who handled the village's petty grievances with the same indifferent efficiency as his lord had done, ensuring that nothing in Eldermere actually changed despite the Baron's failing health. Chapter 24. By the time Almeric reached the 25th year of his reign, his illness had become such a constant presence in his life that he could no longer remember what it felt like to be truly well, though in truth the difference was minimal. Where before he had been mildly bored with life, now he was mildly bored and slightly nauseous most of the time. The castle physician, having exhausted his limited repertoire of treatments, had taken to recommending increasingly bizarre remedies suggested to him in dreams, or possibly by the mushrooms he collected in the forest. No one was entirely sure, none of which had any effect beyond making Almeric's breath smell like a compost heap. The steward, who had been quietly preparing for his lord's eventual demise for several years, had taken to reviewing the genealogical records every few months, though he never seemed to make any progress in identifying a successor, a task made more difficult by the fact that Almeric had no children and most of his known relatives had either died of old age or moved away to places more exciting than Eldermere. The villagers, while politely concerned about their Baron's health, had more pressing matters to attend to. A minor blight affecting the turnip crop that year required considerable attention, though in typical Eldermere fashion it wasn't severe enough to cause real hardship, just bad enough to be annoying. The castle staff went about the duties with the same quiet efficiency as always, though they now took care to walk more softly past Almeric's chambers and had stopped expecting him to join them in the great hall for meals, instead sending up trays of bland, easily digestible foods that the Baron would pick at half-heartedly before pushing aside. Even the castle cats seemed to sense that something was amiss, though their response was simply to avoid Almeric's chambers entirely, preferring to nap in sunnier parts of the castle where the atmosphere was less oppressive. The seasons continued their stately procession regardless, the spring rains giving way to summer warmth, the summer warmth fading into autumn crispness, and the autumn crispness yielding to winter chill with the same reliability they had shown for centuries. Snow fell on Eldermere that winter, not the dramatic, storybook snow that blankets the land in pristine white, but the kind of half-hearted snowfall that melts almost as soon as it touches the ground, leaving behind mud that's somehow more irritating than either pure snow or pure mud would be on its own. Almeric took to spending most of his days sitting by the fire in his chambers, wrapped in a blanket that had been mended so many times it was more patch than original fabric, staring at the flames with the same expression of mild disinterest he had once reserved for court sessions and stewards' reports. The castle's scribe, sensing that the end might be near, began making more detailed entries in the chronicles, though even these were hardly thrilling, mostly noting what Almeric had eaten each day and whether he had managed to leave his bed or not. When the end finally came, it was as undramatic as everything else in Almeric's life. He went to bed one evening feeling slightly worse than usual, failed to wake up the next morning, and was discovered by a chambermaid who had come to light the fire and initially thought he was just sleeping particularly soundly. The steward, when informed, nodded solemnly, made a note to order a coffin from the carpenter, and then went to breakfast, where he spent most of the meal trying to remember whether Almeric had any surviving relatives or if they would need to dig even deeper into the genealogical records this time. The villagers, when they heard the news, paused in their work just long enough to murmur, "Shame," or "He was a decent sort," before returning to their tasks, their thoughts already turning to more immediate concerns like whether the afternoon might bring rain, it wouldn't, or if supper would be the usual pottage, it would. Chapter 25. The question of succession in Eldermere had become something of a tradition in itself, a periodic crisis that was less an actual crisis and more a mildly annoying administrative hurdle that had to be cleared every few decades. The steward, now well into his 70s and showing no signs of retiring despite having served under 3 different barons, approached the problem with the same methodical lack of urgency he brought to all his duties, beginning with a thorough search of the castle archives that mostly consisted of him moving piles of parchment from one side of his desk to the other and sighing heavily whenever anyone interrupted him. The genealogical records, such as they were, had suffered over the years, mice had nibbled some edges, damp had blurred some ink, and at least one important page appeared to have been used to wrap a cheese at some point in the distant past, making the task of identifying Almeric's heir even more challenging than usual. After several weeks of this fruitless searching, the steward was on the verge of declaring the Hargrove line extinct, a conclusion that would have required him to actually make a decision for once, and thus one he was keen to avoid when a chance discovery in the back of a dusty cupboard revealed a previously overlooked branch of the family tree. A second cousin twice removed named Theobald who lived in a nearby valley and made his living as a beekeeper. A messenger was dispatched with all possible speed, which in Eldermere terms meant he left within the month, traveling at a pace that suggested he had somewhere to be eventually but wasn't in any particular hurry to get there. When the message finally reached Theobald, he received the news with the same quiet resignation one might show when told it was going to rain on washing day, not ideal, but hardly unexpected in the grand scheme of things. After consulting with his bees, who buzzed non-committally, packing his meager belongings, a process that took several days as he kept getting distracted by his hives, and saying farewell to his neighbors, a series of conversations that consisted mainly of discussing the weather and speculating about whether Eldermere had good foraging for bees, Theobald set out for his new home at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently to examine interesting flowers or particularly promising stands of clover. His journey, which a more motivated man could have completed in 2 days, stretched into a full week, during which time the castle staff kept busy by doing exactly what they'd always done, secure in the knowledge that whoever their new lord turned out to be, he was unlikely to expect anything more from them than their predecessors had. Theobald's arrival at Eldermere Castle was so understated that several members of the household failed to notice it at all until he was pointed out to them at dinner that evening, his quiet demeanor and nondescript clothing making him blend seamlessly into the background of castle life almost from the moment he crossed the threshold. After being shown to his chambers, which had been hastily aired out following Almeric's death, though they still retained a faint musty odor that no amount of scrubbing seemed able to eliminate, Theobald spent his first evening as Baron-elect sitting by the window watching the bees in the castle garden go about their business, a sight that filled him with quiet contentment even as it made the castle staff slightly nervous, as none of them had much experience with beekeepers and weren't entirely sure what to expect from their new lord. The next morning he was formally presented to the villagers during what passed for a ceremony, really just the weekly market day with slightly cleaner shirts than usual and marginally fresher bread for the customary offering. The villagers greeted their new baron with polite nods before returning to their haggling over eggs and yarn, satisfied that Theobald seemed unlikely to disrupt the comforting monotony of their lives. Theobald, for his part, was pleased to note that the castle gardens had excellent potential for beekeeping, a realization that filled him with quiet satisfaction as he strolled back to the castle to plan where he might place his hives, his mind already buzzing with possibilities that were, in keeping with Eldermere tradition, neither too ambitious nor too exciting, but just interesting enough to make the days pass pleasantly. Chapter 26 The installation of Theobald as the new Baron of Eldermere proceeded with the same lack of ceremony that had characterized all significant events in the kingdom's history, the transition of power marked only by the steward retrieving the slightly moth-eaten ceremonial hat from its box in the castle vaults and placing it upon Theobald's head with about as much enthusiasm as one might show when handing a customer their change at a market stall. The villagers, having been promised the traditional free meal, the same vegetable stew and brown bread served at every coronation for the past century, attended in numbers sufficient to avoid causing offense but not so large as to suggest actual excitement, their conversations revolving around the usual topics of crop yields and the weather rather than the historic nature of the occasion. Theobald himself seemed perfectly content with this muted reception, having no particular desire for pomp or fanfare and being far more interested in inspecting the castle's beehives, which had been neglected for years but showed promising signs of productivity, than in making grand speeches or declarations. His first official act as Baron was to approve the steward's suggestion that they continue using the same system of taxation that had been in place since time immemorial, a system so straightforward and unchanging that even the village children could recite its particulars by heart. His second act was to request honey with his afternoon tea, a modest innovation that caused barely a ripple in the castle's routine beyond the cook having to remember where the honey pots were kept. Life in Eldermere resumed its familiar rhythm almost immediately, the brief interruption of Almeric's death and Theobald's succession fading into memory as quickly as a light summer shower evaporates from cobblestones. The farmers returned to their fields, the blacksmith to his forge, and the castle staff to their endless but undemanding chores, all secure in the knowledge that their new ruler was unlikely to disturb the comfortable monotony that had become Eldermere's defining characteristic. Theobald, for his part, settled into his role with surprising ease, finding that governing Eldermere required about as much effort as maintaining a beehive, occasional attention to prevent problems, but mostly just letting things proceed as they always had. His days developed a pleasant rhythm, mornings spent reviewing the steward's reports, which never contained anything surprising, afternoons tending to his bees in the castle garden, a task that brought him more satisfaction than all his baronial duties combined, and evenings sitting quietly in the great hall listening to the fire crackle and the occasional snore from whichever servant had dozed off first. The villagers, initially curious about the beekeeper baron, soon realized that Theobald differed from his predecessors only in his preferred hobby and returned to their routines without a second thought, their lives continuing much as they had for generations, predictable, comfortable, and utterly devoid of excitement in any form. Even time itself seemed to slow in Eldermere, the days stretching lazily from one to the next without urgency or fanfare, the seasons turning with the same reliable monotony as the pages of a book no one was particularly invested in but couldn't be bothered to stop reading. Chapter 27. The years of Theobald's reign passed with the quiet inevitability of honey dripping from a comb, each one remarkably similar to the last with only the most minor variations to distinguish them. The castle's beehives, under Theobald's careful attention, flourished to an extent not seen in living memory, producing honey that was, while not exactly extraordinary, at least slightly better than average, a fact that filled the Baron with quiet pride even as everyone else in Eldermere took it completely for granted. The steward, now approaching his 80th year but showing no signs of slowing down beyond occasionally forgetting where he'd put his quill, continued his daily reports with the same dogged persistence he'd shown under previous rulers, though these sessions had grown shorter over time as both men realized there was rarely anything of consequence to discuss. The village carried on as it always had, its population remaining remarkably stable, births and deaths being nearly equal in number each year, its economy neither growing nor shrinking but maintaining a perfect equilibrium that would have been the envy of more ambitious kingdoms had anyone in Eldermere cared enough to compare. The only notable event during this period was the Great Bee incident of Theobald's 7th year, when a particularly enthusiastic swarm had temporarily taken over the castle's south tower, a situation that caused mild consternation among the staff until Theobald calmly relocated them to a new hive he'd prepared for just such an occasion. The villagers, when they heard of this excitement, reacted with the usual mild interest, discussing it for perhaps half a day before returning to more pressing matters like the upcoming harvest and whether Widow Cresswell's new cat would be better at catching mice than her old one had been. It wasn't. As Theobald entered his second decade as Baron, his beard now more white than brown and his steps slightly slower than they'd once been, he found himself thinking occasionally about succession, not out of any particular concern for Eldermere's future, but simply because the steward had begun mentioning it with increasing frequency during their meetings. The genealogical records, such as they were, offered few clear answers. Theobald had never married, had no children, and his few known relatives were either deceased or scattered to kingdoms far more interesting than Eldermere. After several months of half-hearted searching, interrupted frequently by more pressing matters like checking on his bees or taking afternoon naps, Theobald and the steward arrived at the same conclusion the predecessors had reached time and again, that the matter could wait until after Theobald's death, at which point it would become someone else's problem. This decision made, life in Eldermere continued its placid course, undisturbed by thoughts of mortality or change, as predictable and comforting as the buzzing of bees in a summer garden. The harvests came and went, each one adequate but never exceptional. The winters were cold but never bitterly so. The springs arrived precisely when expected with just enough rain to water the crops but not so much as to cause flooding. Travelers passing through Eldermere remarked on its unchanging nature, some going so far as to call it quaint or peaceful, though most simply forgot about it entirely within a few days of continuing their journeys. Even the castle's chronicles, which had grown increasingly sparse under Theobald's rule, reflected this timeless quality. Entire years might pass between entries, and those that were recorded tended to be variations on "nothing of note occurred" or "the weather was seasonable." Theobald himself, now comfortably settled into the routines of eldership, spent his days much as he always had, tending his bees, listening to the steward's reports, and enjoying the quiet pleasures of a life that demanded little and offered just enough to be satisfying without ever becoming exciting. His evenings were spent in the great hall, where he would often be found dozing by the fire while the castle's aging minstrel played the same 3 songs he'd been playing for 40 years, the melodies so familiar they blended seamlessly into the background noise of crackling logs and snoring dogs. The years rolled by with the quiet persistence of waves lapping at a very calm shore, each one leaving Eldermere exactly as it had found it, unchanged, unremarkable, and utterly content to remain so for generations to come. Chapter 28. The 35th year of Theobald's reign began much like the 34th had ended, with a winter so mild it barely qualified as winter at all, the snow falling in half-hearted flurries that melted before they could accumulate. and the castle's inhabitants going about their business with only slightly heavier cloaks than usual. Theobald, now well into his 70s and moving with the deliberate care of a man who knows his bones aren't what they used to be, still tended his beloved bees whenever the weather permitted, though he had long since delegated the more physically demanding aspects of beekeeping to a young gardener who showed surprising aptitude for the work. The steward, having finally retired at the remarkable age of 92 or possibly 93, the records were unclear on this point, had been replaced by his granddaughter, a sensible woman of 40 whose chief qualification was her ability to maintain the same level of benign neglect that had served Eldermere so well for generations. The village, while outwardly unchanged, had undergone the subtle transformations that come with the passage of time. The blacksmith's son had taken over the forge, the miller's daughter had married the baker's apprentice, and old man Thatcher had finally passed away at the impressive age of 102, though his complaints about the neighbor's chickens lived on through his equally cantankerous grandson. Theobald's health, while not exactly failing, had begun its slow but inevitable decline, a process so gradual that even the castle physician, who had himself grown quite elderly and forgetful, struggled to pinpoint exactly when it had started. The Baron found himself tiring more easily, napping more frequently, and taking less interest in even his beloved bees, though he still made a point of visiting the hives at least once a week when the weather permitted. The castle staff, sensing that their lord was entering his final years, adjusted their routines accordingly, speaking more softly when near his chambers, ensuring his favorite chair by the fire was always available, and taking care to serve his meals at just the right temperature, neither too hot nor too cold, like everything else in Eldermere. The villagers, when they noticed Theobald's absence from the occasional festival or market day, murmured polite concerns but didn't dwell on the matter, confident that whatever happened would be in keeping with Eldermere's long tradition of uneventfulness. The seasons turned as they always had, the mild winter giving way to a spring that was neither too wet nor too dry, followed by a summer that was pleasantly warm without being uncomfortably hot, and an autumn that arrived precisely on schedule with its usual display of mildly colorful leaves and adequately abundant harvest. Theobald, watching these changes from his favorite window seat, found comfort in their predictability, taking quiet pleasure in the knowledge that Eldermere would continue much as it always had long after he was gone. When the end finally came, it was as undramatic as everything else in Theobald's life. He went to bed one evening after a perfectly ordinary day, failed to wake up the next morning, and was discovered by a chambermaid who initially thought he was just sleeping particularly soundly until she noticed he wasn't snoring. The steward, when informed, nodded solemnly, made a note to order a coffin from the carpenter, and then went to breakfast, where she spent most of the meal trying to remember whether Theobald had ever mentioned any relatives or if they would need to begin yet another exhaustive search of the genealogical records. The villagers, when they heard the news, paused in their work just long enough to murmur, "Shame," or "He was good with bees," before returning to their tasks, their thoughts already turning to more immediate concerns like whether the afternoon might bring rain, it wouldn't, or if supper would be the usual pottage, it would. Even the castle bees seemed unaffected by their keeper's passing, continuing the daily routines with the same quiet industry they'd always shown, the gentle buzzing a fitting requiem for a man who had asked nothing more from life than to be left in peace with his hives and his thoughts. Chapter 29. The question of succession in Eldermere had by this point become something of a tired joke among the castle staff, a periodic crisis that was less an actual crisis and more a mildly annoying administrative hurdle that had to be cleared every few decades. The new steward, being somewhat more efficient than her grandfather had been, though not so efficient as to actually disturb the kingdom's cherished inertia, set about the task with a determination that would have been impressive in any other context, but in Eldermere simply meant she completed the search of the genealogical records in 3 months rather than the usual 6. The records themselves had not improved with age, more pages had gone missing, additional entries had been nibbled by mice, and at least one crucial section appeared to have been used to kindle a fire during a particularly cold winter, but after painstaking reconstruction and more than a few educated guesses, the steward managed to identify Theobald's heir, a distant cousin named Ethelred who made his living as a scribe in a neighboring kingdom and was, by all accounts, even more boring than Theobald had been. A messenger was dispatched with all possible speed, which in Eldermere terms meant he left within the fortnight, traveling at a pace that suggested he had somewhere to be eventually but wasn't particularly concerned about when he arrived. When the message finally reached Ethelred, he received the news with the same quiet resignation one might show when informed that it was going to rain on market day, not ideal, but hardly unexpected in the grand scheme of things. After consulting with his current employer, who was mildly disappointed to lose such a reliable scribe but couldn't fault him for advancing his station, packing his meager belongings, a process that took several days as he insisted on properly labeling everything first, and saying farewell to his colleagues, a series of conversations that consisted mainly of discussing the weather and speculating about whether Eldermere had good libraries, Ethelred set out for his new home at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently to make notes about interesting rock formations or particularly symmetrical trees. His journey, which a more motivated man could have completed in 3 days, stretched into a full week, during which time the castle staff kept busy by doing exactly what they'd always done, secure in the knowledge that whoever their new lord turned out to be, he was unlikely to expect anything more from them than their predecessors had. Ethelred's arrival at Eldermere Castle was so understated that several members of the household failed to notice it at all until he was pointed out to them at dinner that evening, his quiet demeanor and ink-stained fingers making him blend seamlessly into the background of castle life almost from the moment he crossed the threshold. After being shown to his chambers, which had been aired out following Theobald's death but still retained a faint honeyed aroma that no amount of cleaning seemed able to eliminate, Ethelred spent his first evening as Baron-elect organizing the castle's neglected library, a task that filled him with quiet satisfaction even as it made the castle staff slightly nervous, as none of them had much experience with scholars and weren't entirely sure what to expect from their new lord. The next morning, he was formally presented to the villagers during what passed for a ceremony, really just the weekly market day with marginally cleaner shirts than usual and bread that was fractionally fresher than average for the customary offering. The villagers greeted their new baron with polite nods before returning to their haggling over eggs and yarn, satisfied that Ethelred seemed unlikely to disrupt the comforting monotony of their lives. Ethelred, for his part, was pleased to note that the castle archives contained numerous documents in need of cataloguing, a realization that filled him with quiet contentment as he strolled back to the castle to plan his filing system, his mind already buzzing with organizational schemes that were, in keeping with Eldermere tradition, neither too ambitious nor too exciting, but just interesting enough to make the days pass pleasantly. Chapter 30 The installation of Ethelred as the new Baron of Eldermere proceeded with the same lack of ceremony that had characterized all significant events in the kingdom's history, the transition of power marked only by the steward retrieving the increasingly moth-eaten ceremonial hat from its box in the castle vaults and placing it upon Ethelred's head with the same solemnity one might show when putting a lid on a pot of simmering soup. The villagers, having been promised the traditional free meal, the same vegetable stew and brown bread served at every coronation since records began, attended in numbers sufficient to avoid causing offense but not so large as to suggest actual excitement, their conversations revolving around the usual topics of crop yields and the weather rather than the historic nature of the occasion. Ethelred himself seemed perfectly content with this muted reception, having no particular desire for pomp or fanfare and being far more interested in organizing the castle's neglected archives than in making grand speeches or declarations. His first official act as Baron was to approve the steward's suggestion that they continue using the same system of record-keeping that had been in place since time immemorial, though he did quietly begin implementing a new filing system in his private quarters that he hoped might eventually be adopted castle-wide if no one objected too strenuously. His second act was to request an extra candle for his evening reading, a modest innovation that caused barely a ripple in the castle's routine beyond the chandler having to remember where the spare candles were kept. Life in Eldermere resumed its familiar rhythm almost immediately, the brief interruption of Theobald's death and Ethelred's accession fading into memory as quickly as morning mist burns off under a mild autumn sun. The farmers returned to their fields, the blacksmith to his forge, and the castle staff to their endless but undemanding chores, all secure in the knowledge that their new ruler was unlikely to disturb the comfortable monotony that had become Eldermere's defining characteristic. Ethelred, for his part, settled into his role with surprising ease, finding that governing Eldermere required about as much effort as maintaining a well-organized library, occasional attention to prevent chaos, but mostly just letting things proceed as they always had. His days developed a pleasant rhythm, mornings spent reviewing the steward's reports which he actually read, unlike his predecessors, though he found nothing in them worth commenting on, afternoons organizing the castle archives, a task that would take him decades at his current pace, which suited him perfectly, and evenings reading by candlelight from the castle's small but serviceable collection of books, most of which were so dull they could cure insomnia in a matter of pages. The villagers, initially curious about their scholar baron, soon realized that Ethelred differed from his predecessors only in his preferred hobby and returned to their routines without a second thought, their lives continuing much as they had for generations, predictable, comfortable, and utterly devoid of excitement in any form. Even time itself seemed to slow in Eldermere, the days stretching lazily from one to the next without urgency or fanfare, the seasons turning with the same reliable monotony as the pages of a book no one was particularly invested in but couldn't be bothered to stop reading, the years rolling by with the quiet persistence of waves lapping at a very calm shore, each one leaving Eldermere exactly as it had found it, unchanged, unremarkable, and utterly content to remain so for generations to come. Chapter 31. The reign of Ethelred settled into the same comfortable monotony that had characterized Eldermere for generations, the days blending together like the pages of a well-thumbed but largely unread ledger in the castle archives. The new baron's most radical innovation, a system of colored ribbons to categorize documents in the castle library, was met with polite indifference by the staff, who humored their lord's eccentricity while continuing to file important records in the same haphazard fashion they always had. Ethelred, for his part, seemed not to notice or care about this lack of enthusiasm, content to spend his afternoons meticulously transcribing faded parchments that no one would ever read, his quill scratching across vellum with the same rhythmic constancy as the castle's aging water clock dripped away the hours. The steward's daily reports now included brief updates on the archive reorganization project. 3 more deeds from the reign of Baron Hargrove the Unmemorable have been recopied and filed under Taxation Minor, which Ethelred received with the same grave attention he gave to crop yield reports and weather observations. The village continued its timeless rhythms, the farmers planting and harvesting according to the same almanac the great-grandfathers had used, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against the anvil in the same steady cadence that had marked time since before living memory. Even the castle's resident mice seemed to adapt to Ethelred's reign, the usual nibbling of documents shifting to focus exclusively on the least important pastures, as if respecting their new lord's scholarly pursuits. The seasons turned with the usual reliability, spring arriving neither too early nor too late, summer's warmth lingering just long enough to ripen the crops but not so long as to cause discomfort, autumn's crispness giving way to winters that were cold enough to justify extra blankets but never so harsh as to be worth complaining about over supper. Travelers passing through Eldermere during this time remarked on its peculiar timeless quality, how the thatch on the cottages seemed to renew itself at exactly the rate it weathered, how the faces in the village square appeared ageless when viewed across the span of years, how even the children's games were the same simple diversions recorded in tapestries dating back centuries. These observations, when repeated to Ethelred during his rare audiences with visitors, pleased him immensely, though he could never quite articulate why beyond murmuring something about the virtue of continuity before returning to his cataloguing. The castle's chronicles, now maintained with unprecedented precision though no greater frequency, reflected this stasis. Entries for entire years might read simply, all as it should be, or no deviations from established patterns noted. Ethelred's health, never robust but never truly failing either, followed this same pattern of gentle decline so gradual as to be almost imperceptible, a slight worsening of his eyesight that required ever thicker lenses for his reading spectacles, a faint tremor in his hands that made his once perfect penmanship merely legible, a tendency to doze off during particularly dry passages of the steward's reports. The staff adjusted to these changes with the same quiet competence they brought to all their duties, placing footstools where he might need them, ensuring his favorite quills were always sharpened, and developing an uncanny sense for when to bring his afternoon tea just as he began to nod off over his manuscripts. Even time itself seemed to respect Eldermere's traditions, the years passing with such uniformity that the castle's aging sundial might as well have been marking the same day over and over again, its shadow creeping across the same worn markings it had traced for centuries, in a kingdom where nothing ever changed and nothing ever would. Chapter 32. The 43rd year of Ethelred's reign began with a spring so utterly typical that the castle's gardener, when asked to describe it, could only shrug and say, "It's spring," before returning to his methodical pruning of rose bushes that had bloomed with the same modest vigor every year since his grandfather's time. Ethelred, now well into his 80s and moving with the careful deliberation of a man who knows each step might be his last, still maintained his daily routine of archival work, though the sessions had grown shorter and the handwriting in his meticulous logs noticeably shakier. The steward, herself no longer young but still decades Ethelred's junior, had taken to quietly completing some of the Baron's organizational projects during her evenings, knowing how much it would please him to find another shelf properly labeled even if he no longer remembered starting the task. The village, while outwardly unchanged, had undergone the subtle transformations that come with the passage of generations. The blacksmith's grandson now worked the forge, the miller's great-nephew had married the baker's granddaughter, and old widow Cresswell's great-great-grandchildren played the same games of stick and hoop in the square that she had as a child. Ethelred's declining health, while not sudden or dramatic enough to qualify as an actual event in Eldermere's terms, had become sufficiently noticeable that the castle staff had begun the quiet preparations they always made when a baron entered his final years, airing out seldom used guest chambers in case relatives needed to be hosted, though no one could recall Ethelred ever mentioning any, discreetly consulting with the carpenter about coffin measurements just to be prepared, not that there was any urgency, and ensuring the castle's small chapel was kept ready for whatever ceremonies might be required, though no one could remember the last time it had been used for anything beyond storing extra candle holders. The villagers, when they noticed Ethelred's increasingly rare appearances at the castle windows, murmured polite concerns but didn't dwell on the matter, confident that whatever happened would be in keeping with Eldermere's long tradition of uneventfulness. The seasons turned as they always had, the mild spring giving way to a summer that was pleasantly warm without being uncomfortably hot, followed by an autumn that arrived precisely on schedule with its usual display of adequately colorful leaves and sufficiently abundant harvest. Ethelred, watching these changes from his favorite window seat, which the servants had thoughtfully moved closer to the archives to save him steps, found comfort in their predictability, taking quiet pleasure in the knowledge that Eldermere would continue much as it always had long after he was gone. When the end finally came, it was as undramatic as everything else in Ethelred's life. He went to bed one evening after a perfectly ordinary day spent labeling a new batch of tax records, failed to wake up the next morning, and was discovered by a chambermaid who initially thought he was simply sleeping unusually quietly for once. The steward, when informed, nodded solemnly, made a note to order a coffin from the carpenter, glad she'd had the foresight to get preliminary measurements months earlier, and then went to breakfast where she spent most of the meal trying to remember whether Ethelred had ever mentioned any family or if they would need to begin yet another exhaustive search of the genealogical records. The villagers, when they heard the news, paused in their work just long enough to murmur, "Shame," or "He kept good records," before returning to their tasks, their thoughts already turning to more immediate concerns like whether the afternoon might bring rain, it wouldn't, or if supper would be the usual pottage, it would. Even the castle mice seemed to observe a moment of respectful silence before resuming their nibbling of unimportant documents, the quiet scurrying through the archives a fitting tribute to a man who had devoted his life to preserving the history of a kingdom where nothing ever happened worth remembering. Chapter 33. The question of succession in Eldermere had by now become such a well-rehearsed ritual that the castle staff could have performed it in their sleep, which, given how often they dozed off during meetings, they very nearly did. The steward, being more practical than her predecessors, though not so practical as to actually disturb the kingdom's cherished inertia, began her search by consulting Ethelred's own meticulously reorganized genealogical records, hoping the late Baron's scholarly habits might have uncovered some previously overlooked heir. The records, while beautifully catalogued with colored ribbons and neatly labeled tabs, contain no more useful information than they ever had. Generations of Hargroves and their relations, most of whom had died childless or disappeared into obscurity, their lives as unremarkable as the kingdom they might have inherited. After weeks of fruitless searching, interrupted frequently by the need to attend to actual governing matters like approving the annual turnip inventory, the steward was on the verge of declaring the noble line extinct when a chance discovery in the back of a storage cupboard revealed a long-forgotten marriage contract between Ethelred's great-aunt and a minor noble from a neighboring valley. Tracking down this lead, a process that took another month due to Eldermere's characteristically unhurried approach to everything, the steward eventually located the current descendant of this union, a middle-aged woman named Mildred who made her living as a seamstress and was, by all accounts, even more devoted to routine than Ethelred had been. A messenger was dispatched with all possible speed, which in Eldermere terms meant he left before the next full moon, traveling at a pace that suggested he had somewhere to be eventually but wasn't particularly concerned about when he arrived. When the message finally reached Mildred, she received the news with the same quiet resignation one might show when told the hem of one's dress needed redoing, not unexpected, but tedious all the same. After consulting with her embroidery circle, who agreed it was a respectable if unexciting opportunity, packing her considerable fabric collection, a process that took several weeks as each bolt needed to be properly folded and labeled, and saying farewell to her neighbors, a series of conversations that consisted mainly of discussing the weather and speculating about whether Eldermere had good quality thread, Mildred set out for her new home at a leisurely pace, stopping frequently to examine interesting stitching patterns on peasant smocks along the way. Her journey, which a more motivated person could have completed in 4 days, stretched into a fortnight, during which time the castle staff kept busy by doing exactly what they'd always done, secure in the knowledge that whoever their new lady turned out to be, she was unlikely to expect anything more from them than their predecessors had. Mildred's arrival at Eldermere Castle was so understated that several members of the household failed to notice it at all until she was pointed out to them at supper that evening, her quiet demeanor and ever-present sewing basket making her blend seamlessly into the background of castle life almost from the moment she crossed the threshold. After being shown to her chambers, which had been aired out following Ethelred's death but still retained a faint musty parchment smell that no amount of airing seemed able to eliminate, Mildred spent her first evening as Baroness-elect examining the castle's tapestries for loose threads, a task that filled her with quiet satisfaction even as it made the castle staff slightly nervous, as none of them had much experience with needlewomen and weren't entirely sure what to expect from their new ruler. The next morning, she was formally presented to the villagers during what passed for a ceremony, really just the weekly market day with marginally cleaner aprons than usual and bread that was fractionally less stale than average for the customary offering. The villagers greeted their new baroness with polite nods before returning to their haggling over eggs and yarn, the latter of which Mildred examined with professional interest, satisfied that she seemed unlikely to disrupt the comforting monotony of their lives. Mildred, for her part, was pleased to note that the castle's linens were in dire need of repair, a realization that filled her with quiet contentment as she strolled back to the castle to organize her sewing kit, her mind already buzzing with mending projects that were, in keeping with Eldermere tradition, neither too ambitious nor too exciting, but just necessary enough to make the days pass productively. Chapter 34. The installation of Mildred as the new Baroness of Eldermere proceeded with the same lack of ceremony that had characterized all significant events in the kingdom's history, the transition of power marked only by the steward retrieving the now threadbare ceremonial hat from its box in the castle vaults and placing it upon Mildred's head with about as much enthusiasm as one might show when putting a thimble on one's finger. The villagers, Having been promised the traditional free meal, the same vegetable stew and brown bread served at every coronation since before the grandparents' time, attended in numbers sufficient to avoid causing offense but not so large as to suggest actual excitement, their conversations revolving around the usual topics of crop yields and the weather rather than the historic nature of the occasion, though there was some muted discussion about whether a female ruler might finally get the castle's curtains properly mended. Mildred herself seemed perfectly content with this muted reception, having no particular desire for pomp or fanfare and being far more interested in inspecting the castle's linen closets than in making grand speeches or declarations. Her first official act as Baroness was to approve the steward's suggestion that they continue using the same system of household management that had been in place since time immemorial, though she did quietly begin implementing a new inventory system for the castle's textiles that she hoped might eventually be adopted castle-wide if no one objected too strenuously. Her second act was to request an extra cushion for her sewing chair, a modest innovation that caused barely a ripple in the castle's routine beyond the housekeeper having to remember where the spare cushions were stored. Life in Eldermere resumed its familiar rhythm almost immediately, the brief interruption of Ethelred's death and Mildred's accession fading into memory as quickly as a dropped stitch in a well-worn quilt. The farmers returned to their fields, the blacksmith to his forge, and the castle staff to their endless but undemanding chores, all secure in the knowledge that their new ruler was unlikely to disturb the comfortable monotony that had become Eldermere's defining characteristic. Mildred, for her part, settled into her role with surprising ease, finding that governing Eldermere required about as much effort as maintaining a well-stocked sewing kit, occasional attention to prevent chaos, but mostly just letting things proceed as they always had. Her days developed a pleasant rhythm, mornings spent reviewing the steward's reports which she listened to while doing embroidery, finding both activities equally undemanding, afternoons repairing the castle's extensive collection of worn linens, a task that would take her decades at her current pace, which suited her perfectly, and evenings sitting quietly in the great hall with her needlework, the steady rhythm of her stitching blending seamlessly with the crackling of the fire and the occasional snore from whichever servant had dozed off first. The villagers, initially curious about their seamstress Baroness, soon realized that Mildred differed from her predecessors only in her preferred hobby and returned to their routines without a second thought, their lives continuing much as they had for generations, predictable, comfortable, and utterly devoid of excitement in any form. Even time itself seemed to slow in Eldermere, the days stretching lazily from one to the next without urgency or fanfare, the seasons turning with the same reliable monotony as the turning of a spinning wheel, the years rolling by with the quiet persistence of thread unwinding from a spool, each one leaving Eldermere exactly as it had found it, unchanged, unremarkable, and utterly content to remain so for generations to come. Chapter 35 The reign of Mildred settled into the same comfortable monotony that had characterized Eldermere for generations, the days blending together like the stitches in one of her endless mending projects, each one identical to the last, forming a pattern so familiar it required no conscious thought to maintain. The new Baroness's most radical innovation, a system of colored threads to categorize different types of repairs in the castle linens, was met with polite indifference by the staff, who humored their lady's eccentricity while continuing to darn socks and patch sheets in the same haphazard fashion they always had. Mildred, for her part, seemed not to notice or care about this lack of enthusiasm, content to spend her afternoons meticulously repairing tapestries that no one ever looked at, her needle flashing in the firelight with the same rhythmic constancy as the castle's aging clock ticked away the hours. The steward's daily reports now included brief updates on the linen closet reorganization project. 3 more pillowcases have been repaired and filed under bedding serviceable, which Mildred received with the same grave attention she gave to crop yield reports and weather observations. The village continued its timeless rhythms, the farmers planting and harvesting according to the same almanac the great-grandmothers had used, the blacksmith's hammer ringing against the anvil in the same steady cadence that had marked time since before living memory. Even the castle's resident moths seemed to adapt to Mildred's reign, the usual nibbling of fabrics shifting to focus exclusively on the least important linens, as if respecting their new ladies' textile sensibilities. The seasons turned with the usual reliability, spring arriving neither too early nor too late, summer's warmth lingering just long enough to ripen the crops but not so long as to cause discomfort, autumn's crispness giving way to winters that were cold enough to justify extra blankets but never so harsh as to be worth complaining about over supper. Travelers passing through Eldermere during this time remarked on its peculiar timeless quality, how the patches on peasant smocks seemed to follow the same patterns year after year, how the village women still used spinning wheels of ancient design, how even the children's dolls were dressed in miniature versions of garments that hadn't changed style in living memory. These observations, when repeated to Mildred during her rare audiences with visitors, pleased her immensely, though she could never quite articulate why beyond murmuring something about the virtue of a well-made seam, before returning to her embroidery. The castle's chronicles, now maintained with unprecedented attention to textile-related details though no greater frequency, reflected this stasis. Entries for entire years might read simply, all linens in good repair, or, no significant wear noted in household fabrics. Mildred's health, never robust but never truly failing either, followed this same pattern of gentle decline so gradual as to be almost imperceptible, a slight worsening of her eyesight that required ever stronger spectacles for her needlework, a faint stiffness in her fingers that made her once perfect stitches merely serviceable, a tendency to doze off during particularly dry passages of the steward's reports. The staff too adjusted to these changes with the same quiet competence they brought to all their duties, placing footstools where she might need them, ensuring her favorite needles were always threaded, and developing an uncanny sense for when to bring her afternoon tea just as she began to nod off over her mending. Even time itself seemed to respect Eldermere's traditions, the years passing with such uniformity that the castle's aging hourglass might as well have been measuring the same moment over and over again, its sands falling through the same narrow passage they had for centuries, in a kingdom where nothing ever changed and nothing ever would. Chapter 36. The years of Mildred's reign unfolded with the quiet predictability of a well-darned sock, each day so similar to the last that even the castle might cease to notice the passage of time. The Baroness's most ambitious project, a complete inventory of every tapestry, curtain, and bedsheet in the castle, had entered its 12th year with no end in sight, though this troubled no one, least of all Mildred herself, who found profound satisfaction in the methodical repetition of counting and cataloguing the same fabrics season after season. The steward, now well into middle age and having served under 3 successive rulers, had perfected the art of delivering reports in a soothing monotone that blended seamlessly with the rhythmic snip-snip asterisk of Mildred's embroidery scissors, her words dissolving into the background like sugar in lukewarm tea. The village, meanwhile, carried on as it always had, the farmers rising at dawn to tend fields that had been tilled by their ancestors, the blacksmith's hammer striking the anvil in the same pattern it had for generations, the children playing the same games of stick and hoop that had amused Mildred when she was a girl. The only notable event during this period was the great thread shortage of Mildred's 15th year, when a shipment of embroidery floss from the neighboring valley was delayed by 2 whole months due to a bridge being washed out, a crisis so mild it barely qualified as an inconvenience, though it did spark a brief flurry of conversation at the weekly market before everyone returned to discussing the weather. As Mildred entered her twilight years, her once sharp eyesight now reduced to squinting through thick lenses that magnified her eyes to comical proportions, she took to holding court in the castle's solar, a room chosen not for any particular significance but because it had the best light for needlework. The villagers, when they bothered to bring their petty disputes before her at all, found their cases decided with the same indifferent fairness that had characterized Eldermere's justice for centuries, their baroness's rulings delivered between stitches as she repaired yet another frayed tablecloth. Let Thatcher keep the disputed chicken, she might murmur, threading a needle, but tell Cresswell she can have the next one that wanders onto her land. These verdicts, while neither particularly wise nor particularly foolish, had the virtue of being perfectly in keeping with tradition, which was all anyone in Eldermere really asked of their rulers. The castle staff, sensing their lady's gradual decline, adjusted their routines with the same quiet efficiency they brought to all tasks, placing extra cushions on her favorite chair, ensuring her tea was always at precisely the right temperature, tepid, and taking care not to startle her when she dozed off mid-stitch, which was happening with increasing frequency as the years wore on. When the end came, as it inevitably must, even in a place where time moved as sluggishly as Eldermere, it was so undramatic that the chambermaid who discovered Mildred's body initially thought she had simply fallen asleep over her embroidery hoop. It was only when the maid noticed the needle dangling from limp fingers, the thread still trailing to the half-finished sampler that read, "A stitch in time saves," the final word forever left incomplete, that she realized something was amiss. The steward, when informed, sighed deeply, not from grief, but at the prospect of yet another tedious search through the genealogical records, before dutifully sending for the carpenter to discuss coffin measurements. The villagers, upon hearing the news, paused in their work just long enough to murmur, "Shame," or "She kept a tidy household," before returning to their fields and forges, their thoughts already turning to supper and whether the evening might bring rain. It wouldn't. Even the castle's resident moths seemed to observe a moment of respectful silence before resuming their leisurely consumption of the west wing curtains, the quiet fluttering a fitting eulogy for a woman who had devoted her life to maintaining a kingdom where nothing ever changed and nothing ever would. Chapter 37. The question of succession in Eldermere had become such a well-practiced routine that the steward could now perform the necessary steps while half asleep, which, given her advanced age and the general soporific nature of castle life, she very often was. The genealogical records, though beautifully preserved under Mildred's reign, she had rebound them in sturdy linen covers with reinforced stitching, contained no more useful information than they ever had. Generations of Hargroves and their assorted relations, most of whom had died childless or disappeared into comfortable obscurity. After weeks of fruitless searching, punctuated by frequent naps and the occasional diversion to approve utterly mundane matters like the annual inventory of pickled barrels, the steward was on the verge of declaring the noble line extinct when a chance discovery in the back of a storage chest revealed a long-forgotten letter mentioning a second cousin twice removed named Hubert who had allegedly taken holy orders in a monastery some 3 valleys away. Tracking down this lead, a process that took the better part of a season, as the messenger sent to investigate kept getting distracted by particularly interesting rock formations along the way, the steward eventually located Hubert, a portly, balding monk whose chief virtues were his complete lack of ambition and his ability to sleep through even the most enthusiastic Gregorian chanting. When informed of his unexpected inheritance, Hubert received the news with the same mild dismay one might show when told the refectory was serving turnips again *, but after consulting his abbot, who saw this as an excellent opportunity to gain influence in a neighboring realm, however insignificant, he reluctantly agreed to assume the title. Packing his meager belongings, a process that took several weeks, as Hubert insisted on properly blessing each item before wrapping it in clean linen and saying farewell to his fellow monks, a series of conversations that consisted mainly of discussing the weather and speculating about whether Eldermere's monastery had better wine cellars than the current one, Hubert set out for his new home at a pace that could charitably be described as glacial. His arrival at Eldermere Castle was so unremarkable that the guards at the gate failed to notice him entirely until he cleared his throat for the 3rd time, by which point he'd already unpacked his satchel and begun reciting evening prayers in the courtyard. The steward, upon being informed that their new lord had arrived, and was currently taking a nap in the chapel after his journey, merely nodded and ordered the servants to prepare the usual coronation stew, confident that Hubert would wake in time for dinner. The villagers, when they heard the news, reacted with the customary polite indifference, though there was some muted speculation about whether a monk might finally get around to repairing the castle's leaky roof. He wouldn't. Hubert's coronation, if one could call it that, was perhaps the least ceremonial transfer of power in Eldermere's long and unremarkable history. The steward, too tired to retrieve the ceremonial hat from its box, the moths having gotten to it at last, simply placed a slightly less moth-eaten substitute on Hubert's head during a lull in the meal, an action so casual that several attendees missed it entirely while reaching for the bread. Hubert, for his part, seemed perfectly content with this arrangement, spending most of the feast nodding off between courses and waking only to murmur blessings over the salt cellar. As the torches burned low and the villagers drifted back to their homes, full of stew and mildly curious about what sort of ruler their new monk baron would make, Hubert retired to his chambers, not to sleep, as he'd been doing that all afternoon, but to begin what would become his life's work, compiling an exhaustive history of napping techniques throughout the ages, a project that would occupy him for the remainder of his days and produce a manuscript so stunningly dull that even the castle mice refused to nibble on it. And so life in Eldermere continued, undisturbed by ambition or change, as predictable and comforting as a well-worn prayer bead passing through familiar fingers. The fields were planted and harvested, the seasons turned, and the people of Eldermere went about their lives with quiet contentment, secure in the knowledge that under Hubert's benign neglect, nothing would ever disrupt the soothing monotony they held so dear. Even time itself seemed to pause in Eldermere, the years stretching out like a lazy cat in a sunbeam, each one indistinguishable from the last in a kingdom where nothing ever happened and nothing ever would. Chapter 40 The reign of Algernon unfolded with the quiet inevitability of fungal growth, slow, methodical, and largely unnoticed by anyone not actively looking for it. The castle staff quickly adapted to their new lord's peculiar habits, learning to step carefully around the mushroom cultures he cultivated in dark corners and to never, under any circumstances, disturb the interesting specimens he left drying on windowsills. The steward's daily reports now included a new section titled Mycological Observations, which Algernon studied with far more attention than he ever gave to matters of state, his long fingers tracing the descriptions of particularly promising mold growths in the castle cellars with something approaching reverence. The village continued its timeless routines undisturbed, the farmers rising with the sun, though Algernon certainly didn't, preferring the damp hours before dawn for fungal foraging, the blacksmith's hammer providing a steady counterpoint to the squelching sounds of the baron's daily mushroom hunts, the children learning to identify but not touch the various fungi their new ruler introduced to the castle gardens. The only notable event during Algernon's early reign was the great morel misunderstanding of his third year, when a visiting merchant mistook the baron's prized mushroom bed for a salad ingredient and nearly sparked an international incident before being placated with a complimentary wheel of cheese slightly moldy, just as Algernon preferred it. As years passed and Algernon's beard grew increasingly streaked with spores, his kingdom became a haven for fungal diversity unseen elsewhere in the realm. The castle walls developed a patina of interesting lichens, the tapestries hosted thriving colonies of textile-eating molds, and even the royal crown, such as it was, acquired a permanent resident in the form of a particularly tenacious shelf fungus. The villagers, initially wary of their fungus-obsessed ruler, gradually came to appreciate his quiet reign. After all, a baron who spent all day staring at moldy logs was a baron unlikely to impose new taxes or start unnecessary wars. Their petitions, when they bothered to bring them at all, were invariably answered with distracted murmurs about symbiotic relationships and spore dispersal patterns before being settled in the most predictable way possible. Let the mushrooms decide, Algernon would often say when faced with particularly thorny disputes, then spend hours explaining how mycelial networks demonstrated perfect conflict resolution strategies to anyone unfortunate enough to still be listening. When the end came, as it must even for men who smell strongly of damp earth, it was perhaps the most Algernon-esque death imaginable. The baron simply failed to return from his daily mushroom hunt, his body eventually discovered in a particularly moist corner of the forest where he appeared to have sat down to examine an intriguing fungal specimen and never gotten back up. His face was frozen in an expression of quiet wonder, one gnarled finger still pointing at what turned out to be a completely ordinary but to Algernon, undoubtedly fascinating patch of mildew. The steward, upon being informed, sighed the sigh of a woman who had buried too many eccentric rulers and immediately began mentally preparing for yet another tedious search through the genealogical records. The villagers, when they heard the news, paused just long enough to comment on how peaceful Algernon looked and how he was probably happier decomposing among his beloved fungi anyway. before returning to the daily routines. Even the castle's mold colonies seemed to observe a moment of respectful stillness before resuming their steady consumption of the ancient tapestries, the quiet growth a fitting tribute to a ruler who had appreciated them like no other. Chapter 41. The question of succession in Eldermere had by now become such a well-worn ritual that the steward could perform it while simultaneously reviewing the annual turnip reports and taking her afternoon nap. The genealogical records, though slightly nibbled at the edges by what appeared to be mushroom-loving insects, revealed, after 3 weeks of desultory searching, the existence of a distant cousin named Wilhelmina who had reportedly taken up residence in a nearby swamp studying amphibian mating habits. The messenger dispatched to locate her returned 6 months later covered in algae and bearing news that Wilhelmina would accept the position, provided she could bring her collection of breeding toads. The castle staff, having long since abandoned any expectation of normalcy from their rulers, simply sighed and began preparing the dampest chambers for her arrival. Wilhelmina's coronation was perhaps the moistest in Eldermere's history, the throne room filled with the sounds of croaking and the distinct smell of wetland as her prize toads explored their new home. The ceremonial hat, now more mushroom than fabric, was placed upon her head while she was distracted counting tadpoles in the baptismal font, and the feast that followed featured an unusual number of fly-based dishes to accommodate her amphibious companions. As the years passed, Wilhelmina's reign became known for its quiet dedication to wetland conservation and an unprecedented number of slightly damp legal decrees regarding pond maintenance. The villagers, initially perplexed by their frog-obsessed baroness, soon came to appreciate her hands-off governing style, where not knee-deep in swamp water documenting mating calls, Wilhelmina could generally be relied upon to approve whatever the steward suggested without reading it. When Wilhelmina eventually succumbed to what court physicians described as an unfortunate misunderstanding with a particularly territorial bullfrog, the castle staff didn't even bother consulting the genealogical records. They simply sent word to the nearest monastery, swamp, and mushroom field that Eldermere was accepting applications for its next ruler, with the only requirements being a complete lack of ambition and a suitably eccentric hobby to pass the time. As the sun set over the castle's algae-covered towers, the kingdom's many frogs sang a chorus of quiet contentment, for in Eldermere, nothing ever changed, and nothing ever would. Chapter 42. The selection process for Eldermere's next ruler unfolded with the same lack of urgency that characterized all things in the kingdom, the steward having posted the notice for applications on the castle gates where it gradually faded into illegibility over the course of several rainy seasons. The first applicant arrived nearly a year later, a retired beekeeper named Bertram whose chief qualifications were his ability to sit perfectly still for hours and his encyclopedic knowledge of honey viscosity variations by season. The castle staff, after observing him dozing peacefully in the courtyard while bees buzzed undisturbed around his head, unanimously declared him perfect for the position without even bothering to interview the other candidates, not that there were any. Bertram's coronation ceremony consisted mainly of the steward carefully placing the remains of the ceremonial hat, now more wax than fabric after years of bee-related modifications, atop his balding head while he snored gently in the afternoon sun, the castle's resident bees immediately taking a liking to him and constructing several small hives in his beard by the end of the week. Bertram's reign proved to be one of exceptional tranquility even by Eldermere standards, his days divided equally between napping in the herb garden and holding one-sided conversations with his buzzing subjects, the steward having wisely learned to conduct all official business while standing upwind of his honey-dripping liege. The village flourished in its usual unremarkable way under this apian administration, the farmers adapting to the castle's new policy of planting every third field exclusively with clover, the children learning to identify different bee species instead of pointless subjects like mathematics, and the blacksmith developing a sideline in fashionable yet functional beekeeping veils. The only minor crisis during Bertram's decades-long reign occurred when a traveling merchant made the fatal mistake of swatting at one of the castle's resident bees, resulting in His Majesty issuing the first and only royal decree anyone could remember: no swatting, ever. This momentous legislation was carved into a piece of honeycomb and displayed prominently in the village square, where it gradually melted over the course of the summer, much like everyone's memory of the incident. When Bertram finally passed away peacefully, in his sleep, surrounded by his beloved bees who respectfully refrained from stinging the corpse until after the funeral, the villagers honored him in their typical fashion, by pausing just long enough to remark on what a nice day it was for bees before returning to their afternoon naps. The castle staff, after a brief conference held safely inside a smoke-filled room, determined that the bees had technically been left in charge by Bertram's will, a single hexagon of wax with some suspiciously bee-shaped indentations, and therefore no new ruler needed to be selected, a decision everyone found immensely satisfactory as it required absolutely no effort from anyone. And so Eldermere became the world's first apiocracy, a kingdom governed by the gentle hum of bees and the timeless rhythms of honey production, where nothing ever changed except the flowers in season and nothing ever would. Chapter 43 The Bee Administration of Eldermere, as it came to be known in the few history books that bothered mentioning it, proved to be perhaps the most effective governance the kingdom had ever experienced, if one measured effectiveness by the complete absence of complaints and the steady production of excellent honey. The castle staff quickly adapted to their new insect overlords, learning to interpret the different pitches of hive humming as either approval or mild disapproval of various proposals, though since the bees were generally indifferent to human affairs, most sounds were taken as approval by default. The steward's daily reports were now delivered to the largest hive in the throne room, formerly Bertram's favorite napping spot, where they were politely ignored in favor of more pressing matters like pollen collection and comb construction. The village flourished under this apian rule, the farmers developing an uncanny sense for when the bees wanted certain flowers planted, the children learning to communicate through interpretive dance, which the bees seemed to find mildly entertaining, and even the blacksmith discovering his true calling as a designer of increasingly elaborate honey extraction equipment. The only notable event during this period was the great nectar debate of the 7th apian year, when a particularly dry summer led to heated discussions by bee standards about foraging priorities, resolved when the queen herself emerged to settle the matter by doing absolutely nothing before returning to her chambers, a decision universally praised for its wisdom and restraint. As years passed and the castle became increasingly encrusted with honeycomb, structural integrity be damned, visitors to Eldermere often remarked on the peculiar sight of humans and bees going about their separate business in perfect harmony, the former napping in the shade while the latter buzzed industriously overhead, both species united in their complete lack of interest in disturbing the status quo. The kingdom's chronicles, now maintained by a specially trained scribe who was allergic to bees and therefore wrote from a safe distance, recorded this era as one of unprecedented stability, each entry reading some variation of "bees did bee things. Humans napped. Weather adequate." When the original queen bee eventually passed away, her death noted only by a slight change in the hive's fragrance and the prompt election of a successor, the villagers honored her memory in their typical fashion, by setting out an extra bowl of sugar water and taking slightly longer naps than usual that afternoon. The castle staff, after a brief discussion held at the very edge of bee hearing range, determined that the new queen was every bit as qualified as her predecessor and therefore no changes to the government were necessary, a decision that pleased everyone except the bees, who couldn't have cared less either way. And so life in Eldermere continued, sweet and unchanging as the honey dripping from 1,000 quiet combs, the days blending together like the layers of wax in a well-tended hive, the years passing with the gentle hum of wings in a kingdom where nothing ever happened and nothing ever would. Chapter 44 The apiocracy of Eldermere entered its second decade with all the fanfare of a drowsy bee drifting from one flower to another, quietly, methodically, and with no particular hurry. The castle had by this point become more hive than habitation, its stone walls barely visible beneath layers of golden comb that gleamed dully in the sunlight, its corridors filled with the soporific hum of countless wings vibrating at just the right frequency to induce afternoon naps in any humans who lingered too long. The steward, now well into her 80s and having served under more rulers, both human and insect, than anyone could remember, had taken to conducting official business while wearing a beekeeper's veil at all times, not out of any real necessity, but because the gentle mesh filtering her vision made the kingdom's paperwork slightly more bearable. Her daily reports to the hive had evolved into a sort of meditative chanting that bore no resemblance to actual governance, but which the bees seemed to find pleasantly rhythmic, if the contented buzzing was any indication. The village, meanwhile, had adapted to apian rule with the same effortless complacency it brought to all things, the farmers planting according to the bees' pollination patterns rather than any calendar, the children learning to identify different honey varieties by taste before they could read, and the tavern having introduced a mead so potent it explained much about the general lack of concern regarding their insect overlords. The only minor disturbance during this period was the brief wax shortage of the 15th apian year, when an unusually damp spring caused the castle's main hive to expand into the steward's office, resulting in 3 weeks of delayed paperwork, a crisis only noted because it meant the annual turnip census was late for the first time in living memory. As years passed and the castle became increasingly indistinguishable from a very large, slightly square beehive, visitors to Eldermere often found themselves uncertain where architecture ended and apiculture began. The throne room now featured a magnificent honeycomb cathedral ceiling. The chapel's stained glass windows had been replaced with translucent sheets of beeswax that glowed golden in the sunlight, and even the castle's ancient suits of armor had been repurposed as surprisingly effective swarm catchers. The kingdom's chronicles, now maintained by a specially trained scribe who communicated exclusively through interpretive dance, the bees found it amusing, recorded this era as one of unprecedented sweetness, each entry reading some variation of bees built. Humans napped. Honey excellent. The villagers, for their part, had developed a sophisticated system of apicultural democracy where important decisions were made by leaving various options out in bowls of sugar water and seeing which one attracted the most bees, a method that resulted in such enlightened policies as more napping encouraged and turnip taxes slightly reduced but not too much. When the second queen bee eventually passed away, her death marked only by a slight decrease in honey production for exactly 1 day before her successor took over, the humans honored her memory in their typical fashion, by declaring an impromptu holiday that looked exactly like every other day in Eldermere, except with marginally more meat consumption. The castle staff, after a brief discussion conducted entirely through yawns and hand gestures, determined that the new queen was every bit as qualified as her predecessors and therefore no changes to the government were necessary, a decision that pleased everyone except the bees, who continued the quiet work as if nothing had changed at all. And so life in Eldermere continued, sweet and unchanging as honey straight from the comb, the days blending together like the layers of wax in a well-tended hive, the years passing with the gentle hum of wings in a kingdom where nothing ever happened and nothing ever would. Chapter 45 The Great Hive Mind of Eldermere, as it had come to be known in the few outside regions that remembered the kingdom existed, reached its apogee, or perhaps its nadir, depending on one's perspective, when the bees finally completed their architectural masterpiece, the complete encasement of the entire castle in a magnificent, if slightly lopsided, honeycomb dome that glowed golden in the sunlight like her oversized lantern. The steward, now well into her 90s and having long since given up any pretense of human governance, spent her days dozing in a pollen-scented corner of what had once been the Great Hall, waking only to occasionally murmur approval at whatever the bees had most recently constructed. The villagers, having fully embraced their apian overlords, had developed an entire culture based around honey-based products and strategic napping locations, their lives moving with the same drowsy rhythm as the bees' seasonal cycles. The blacksmith, in a stroke of genius that typified Eldermere's approach to innovation, had created a series of beautifully crafted but entirely unnecessary honey dippers that became the kingdom's chief export, not because anyone particularly needed them, but because they made excellent gifts for visiting dignitaries who couldn't think of anything else to ask for. The only notable event during this golden age of apicultural rule was the great pollen mix-up of the 22nd apian year, when a confused migratory bird dropped some exotic flower pollen into the castle's main hive, resulting in 3 days of unusually energetic buzzing that the humans interpreted as either divine revelation or indigestion. The scribe's interpretive dance leaned toward the latter. As decades passed and the honeycomb structures grew ever more elaborate, the bees having recently added a spectacular wax rendition of the castle's original towers, complete with edible miniature banners, Eldermere became less a kingdom and more a living art installation dedicated to the virtues of sweet tranquility. Visitors, now arriving in slightly greater numbers thanks to rumors of that place with the nice honey and all the napping, often found themselves staying much longer than intended, lulled into the kingdom's rhythm by the constant hum of wings and the ever-present scent of warm wax. The castle's chronicles, now maintained by a specially trained bee who had somehow learned to walk in tiny circles over parchment, leaving behind trails that might, with sufficient imagination, be interpreted as letters, recorded this era as one of perfect harmony, each entry reading some variation of Bee's bust. Humans slept. World ignored us. Perfect. When the third queen bee eventually passed away, her death marked only by a brief period of slightly less perfectly hexagonal comb construction, the humans honored her memory in their typical fashion, by doing absolutely nothing different, secure in the knowledge that the hive mind would continue as it always had. And so life in Eldermere persisted, sweet and unchanging as honey preserved in amber, the days blending together like the layers of wax in an eternal hive, the years passing without notice or care in a kingdom where nothing ever happened and nothing ever would, a perfect, golden stasis that would endure, undisturbed, until the end of time itself. Chapter 46 The eternal apiocracy of Eldermere continued its golden slumber through centuries uncounted. The great honeycomb dome now so thick that the original stone castle beneath had become little more than a vague memory preserved in the increasingly drowsy recollections of the villages. The steward position had long since been retired, not through any formal decision, but because the last holder of the office had dozed off mid-report sometime in the previous century and nobody had the heart to wake her. Governance, to the extent it existed at all, was conducted through a complex system of yawns, stretches, and contented sighs that the bees seemed to understand perfectly, responding with subtle changes in hive vibrations that somehow always resulted in exactly enough honey being produced and exactly enough naps being taken. The village had evolved into a utopia of comfortable indolence, its inhabitants moving with the slow, deliberate pace of honey dripping from a spoon, their lives measured not in years but in the gradual darkening of their mead barrels and the slow accumulation of beeswax on their windowsills. The blacksmith's forge, now operating approximately 3 days a year when the bees decided it was time to make more honey dippers, had become more shrine than workplace, its anvil polished to a mirror shine by generations of villagers who mostly just liked the way it reflected the afternoon sun for optimal napping conditions. The only notable event in recent memory was the Great Nap of 327 AB. Anno Bombus, when the entire human population of Eldermere had simultaneously dozed off for what might have been 3 days or possibly 3 weeks, nobody was entirely sure, and nobody particularly cared to investigate. Chapter 47 Millennia drifted past the honey-glazed borders of Eldermere like clouds across a summer sky, noticed, perhaps, but never remarked upon. The great honeycomb structures had by now fossilized into golden amber monuments to tranquility, their surfaces polished smooth by the wings of countless generations of bees who continued the quiet work more out of habit than necessity. The villages, if they could still be called that, had perfected the art of existing in perfect harmony with their apian overlords, communicating through subtle variations in snoring patterns, nourished by honey that seemed to replenish itself magically, and sleeping so deeply that aging had become more a theoretical concept than a physical reality. The position of scribe had evolved into a ceremonial role where the holder would sleep atop a pile of ancient parchments, their dreams occasionally producing sounds that might, with imagination, be interpreted as historical documentation. The castle's chronicles now consisted of a single, eternal entry carved into a wall of golden wax that simply read, "Yes," in letters that shimmered faintly in the candlelight. Visitors to Eldermere, though none had come in living memory, would have found a kingdom preserved in perfect apicultural amber, where time itself seemed to have fallen asleep in the warm afternoon sun, content to let the bees handle whatever needed handling while the humans dreamed sweet, simple dreams of nothing in particular. And so Eldermere endured, unchanged and unchangeable, a perfect testament to the virtues of doing absolutely nothing with quiet dedication, a kingdom where nothing ever happened, nothing ever changed, and nothing ever would, forever and ever, Amen. Chapter 48. The fossilized honeycomb dome of Eldermere had reached such proportions that distant travelers now mistook it for a small golden mountain, its surfaces glinting dully in the sunlight like a mammoth beehive left by some forgotten race of giant insects. Within this amber monument to indolence, the bees, unchanged in temperament though slightly larger in size after centuries of uninterrupted peace, continued their meticulous upkeep of the kingdom's sole export, exquisite boredom preserved in wax. The villages, though the term had lost meaning since they'd stopped doing anything resembling village activities, existed in a state of such perfect lethargy that anthropologists would have wept with frustration had any bothered to visit. Children were born, grew up, and aged without ever experiencing anything resembling excitement, their most strenuous activity being the occasional slow blink to confirm they hadn't actually died. The position of royal taster had evolved into a ceremonial role where the holder would lie motionless beneath honey drips, their tongue occasionally protruding to confirm the vintage hadn't changed. It hadn't. The only notable event in recent centuries was the Great Yawn of 1523 AB, when the entire population simultaneously stretched their arms in such perfect unison that it caused a minor air current the bees briefly found annoying. Chapter 49. The bees of Eldermere, having long since perfected their apicultural utopia, turned their attention to more philosophical pursuits, specifically, the question of whether honey tasted better when everyone was napping or really napping. This earth-shaking debate occupied approximately 17 generations of worker bees who conducted meticulous experiments, involving strategically placed snores and varying levels of drool, before reaching the groundbreaking conclusion that it made absolutely no difference whatsoever. Meanwhile, the human inhabitants had reached such advanced states of lethargy that breathing had become optional for most, their heartbeats slowing to the pace of a glacier contemplating retirement. The castle archives, now preserved in crystallized honey tablets that doubled as emergency snacks, recorded this era as the time of very little, followed by several blank tablets that scholars agreed perfectly captured the zeitgeist. Visitors from neighboring kingdoms, had there been any, would have marveled at how the blacksmith's forge had been repurposed as a communal napping nook, its bellows repurposed to gently waft the scent of lavender and laziness across the dozing populace. The only minor disturbance during this period was the great pillow fluffing of 1896 AB, when a particularly ambitious chambermaid briefly considered plumping the royal cushions before thinking better of it and taking a decade-long nap instead. Chapter 50 ****. As the third millennium of apian rule dawned over Eldermere, the bees, now undisputed masters of apathy, faced the greatest challenge yet, remembering why they'd bothered making so much honey in the first place. This existential crisis, if something so lethargic could be called a crisis, resulted in a dramatic 0.3% reduction in honey production that went entirely unnoticed by the human population, who were busy not noticing most things. The village square, now permanently imprinted with the buttock-shaped depressions of countless generations of sedentary philosophers, had become a sort of open-air temple to doing absolutely nothing with style. The position of royal astronomer had evolved into simply staring at the sky until night fell, while the castle guards now performed the duties by dreaming vividly about guarding things. The kingdom's chronicles for this era consist of a single wax tablet that reads, "Still here," in letters so lazy they barely qualify as writing. The only notable event was the Great Sigh of 2345 AB, when the entire population exhaled simultaneously in perfect contentment, causing a minor humidity change that the bees politely ignored. Chapter 51 The bees of Eldermere, having achieved perfect societal stasis, began experimenting with avant-garde honeycomb structures, not because they served any purpose, but because breaking from tradition would have required too much effort. The resulting architectural marvels, including a spectacularly pointless spiral comb that went nowhere slowly, were admired briefly by the human population before everyone mutually agreed that looking at things was overrated. The village had by this point reached such advanced states of relaxation that even the concept of time had given up and gone to sleep, the sundials now serving as very comfortable headrests for afternoon naps. The position of royal minstrel had evolved into occasional nasal exhalations that might, after several glasses of mead, be mistaken for music. The castle's archives now consisted entirely of wax tablets that simply read, "Copy of previous tablet," in increasingly faint handwriting. The only minor disturbance during this period was the Great Blanket Adjustment of 2789 AB, when someone briefly considered being slightly less comfortable before wisely abandoning the idea. Chapter 52 in what future historians would call the time of really just unbelievable laziness, Eldermere achieved its final evolutionary form as a society where even breathing had become more of a casual hobby than a necessity. The bees, now so relaxed they produced honey through sheer osmosis, maintained the kingdom's golden stasis through gentle buzzing at frequencies scientifically proven to induce maximum napping efficiency. The villagers communicated exclusively through subtle variations in snoring patterns, their dreams so uneventful that they qualified as historical records. The position of royal physician had evolved into occasionally poking people to confirm they weren't dead, though the distinction had become largely academic. The castle's chronicles for this era consist of a single wax tablet that simply shows a stick figure lying down, which scholars agree perfectly encapsulates the kingdom's cultural zenith. And so Eldermere endured, unchanging and unchangeable, a perfect amber monument to the art of doing absolutely nothing forever, a kingdom where nothing ever happened, nothing ever changed, and nothing ever would, until the stars themselves grew tired and went to sleep.